This morning we're going to talk about persuasion, and that's why I want everybody to be right with it, because in one sense I suppose this is the ultimate skill, and it should put together all the other skills. We know a lot about persuasion because it's been studied so extensively over a long period of time. If there's one thing, one point more than any other that you need to bear in mind if you want to persuade somebody else, it's the key phrase that marketing people use and that public relations people use, and it goes like this. You have to key it to their needs and values. Anything to get into our psychology at all has to come in by the route of something we already trust and accept, some idea that we already trust and accept. And so therefore, when we want to persuade others, the thing to remember is we have to relate what it is we want to persuade them about to the existing needs and values of their lives. So what does that mean? That means that all persuasion then begins in finding out what these are. Where are they? What do they think? What do they believe? What are their feelings, their attitudes? And once we know that, it's kind of like surfing. You can ride those waves in and maybe get inside their system and have them accept your idea. But when we go to people with an idea that is foreign to their value system and we say we're going to persuade them, we're really just kidding ourselves. We're talking now about probably a 1-year, 2-year, 5-year process, even if we can do it then, to get them to change their values. Now, the scholars who've looked at this have asked, well, are there any specific techniques that we can use? And interestingly, there are. In fact, they tell us there are 6 ways that we can persuade people. And interestingly, only 6. The 6 methods are like this. The first method is called the rational method. But as you must have garnered from what I said in the previous 2 days, it doesn't really work. It works with very, very few people. There are some innovators, remember, a few innovators who will take the data, the facts, presented rationally, and they'll say, oh yes. Now, why is this listed then as one of the persuasive methods? For 2 reasons. There is a small body of people who will be persuaded on specific issues based on a logical presentation. But more importantly, all persuasion for us, for the persuader, should start here. Because if we can't make an honest, rational case for it, then ethically we have no business plugging in any of the other methods to try to persuade people. We're trying to put something over on them if we can't ourselves lay it out and say, now look, this really makes sense, there's plenty of data here, it's a logical progression. If you can't do that, you have no business doing the rest. So it's one of the 6 methods. Now let's talk about the 5 that really work. The next method is called the association method. And what it means is simply that we associate whatever we're trying to persuade people about to something that they already have been persuaded about. Example. When Ronnie Reagan gives a speech, as you probably noticed, he stands up here like this, and right here is the Great Seal of the President of the United States, because we accept that symbol as a symbol of authority, and so naturally he wants to link his messages to that symbol. When politicians give a speech, you've probably noticed they're always very careful to have the American flag either draped across behind them or standing over here on a standard, because they want to remind us again that they are linked, they are associated with that which we have already accepted. We've sort of gotten away from this very simple method of just linking to something they already accept, and it is powerful. So that's one method. The next method is called the motivation method. Later on today we're going to have a short session on the specifics of motivation. The motivation method of persuasion began really in the 50s and 60s with the work of a famous psychologist, Ernest Dichter. Dichter wondered how, he was working primarily for advertising agencies, and he wondered how we could motivate people to exhibit behaviors that involve purchasing the product or using the service. And so he would simply study groups of people to find out what really motivated them. And then he would have the appeal in the ad play to that motivation. Well, we're all very, very familiar with this method, but it is powerful. For example, well, what are we doing with dereg? We assume that it's going to be economic development that's a motivator here in this state. And so we have linked dereg to this motivator. People who need income, wealth, growth. And so that's essentially what we've done there. The third method, which is probably the most powerful of all, is social rewards and punishments. This goes back to the fourth step of diffusion process, social trial, and the power of this I think we all know. If we can make it socially rewarding to adopt a certain idea, candidate, product. In other words, if other people say, oh yeah, oh wow, then it's good. If we can make it a social punishment, people tend not to adopt it. It's just the whole business of wanting our peers to approve what we do, and it is, as I say, this is tremendously powerful. I mentioned yesterday about Jim Grunig's new model for motivating mass behavior on subjects like drunk driving or wearing seat belts. The fourth step in his model, the one that really knocks it home so it becomes behavioral pattern among masses of people, is when the idea becomes totally socially acceptable. And let me give you an example. Oh, maybe even 5 years ago, it was okay in American society to come in on Monday morning, kind of, you know, typical Monday morning, and saying, wow, I went to this great party Saturday night and I really got loaded, and gosh, you know, I was under the tables, and everybody laugh and say, wow, that must have been quite a bash. Remember that? Do it now. Just try it now. People will say, you dope, you know, you jerk, what's the matter with you? We don't behave that way. So what we have done to persuade people against drunk driving is to take that kind of living it up style and move it from a social reward where everybody said, wow, you really had a party, over to a social punishment where they say, what's wrong with you? Lots of power in that. The next method is also powerful, but rather difficult, or at least the most difficult to employ. I'm sorry, what that says is whole personality. What this means is that instead of picking a little piece like the brain, the association with some accepted attitude, the motivations of the person, the social realm in which the person functions, we try to deal with all of those because all of those go into making up our personalities. We have to put together persuasive messages that touch the whole personality. Let me give you an example of how that works and why it works. On a broad scale, there are certain personality characteristics, particularly among large groups, which will tend 9 times out of 10 to take a certain position. Case in point. The folks who started the modern activist movement, activism for social change, in the late 50s, in New England at the naval base, worried about nuclear war, are pretty much the same personality profile of folks who then were the civil rights activists in the early 60s and mid-60s. If you think about the profile of personality, those same folks were the environmentalists, those same kind of folks. I'm not saying, you know, that every person went from issue to issue, but if you think about the people and the things that made up their personality profile, it was the same people who became the environmental activists. Then they moved on to Vietnam, And then after Vietnam, they all went into Zen Buddhism and holistic health and all that stuff. They kind of went into hibernation, actually. And now they're coming back out again, worried about nuclear war. And if you could draw a personality profile of the leaders and the members of those groups, you'd see that they would be very similar. You could draw some other profiles on the other side of the fence. People who are pro-choice, pro-life on the abortion issue tend to be in favor of capital punishment, of tough treatment of criminals, tend to be in favor of not spending much money on welfare and social programs. Now, as I say, you got to be very careful here, because, boy, you can just stereotype that to death. But it is an underlying fact that our value systems will show themselves on issues much of the time. And actually, a personality of a person is, to a large extent, our behavior around our value system. So if we know what those value systems are, and if we draw a personality profile, we can appeal to that. The sixth method, and this one has only been accepted by the scholars of this for about 10 years, actually was developed by one of my colleagues, Dr. Otto Lurbinger. He began wondering, why does anybody buy an American car? You know, because he compared on a rational basis American cars with Japanese and European cars. And if you looked at the gas mileage, at the repair records, at the length of service, the American cars came in last on all of those scales. So he said, well, why are we buying them at all? So he did a study. Here's what he found. I told you yesterday how bombarded we are with messages. Well, Otto found that the average American sees that about 350 to 400 times a day. And so the repetition of that again and again and again makes it very persuasive. Persuasive in an interesting kind of a way, because we can't verbalize that. If you ask people, well, you know, did you buy this because you're familiar with Chevrolet? They'd say, nah, not me. I'm a rational, independent American. You know, I looked at all the catalogs and I made up my mind based on gas mileage and so forth, which would be a sheer lie. So it's really working subliminally inside us, but it is persuasive. The question is, how can we plug these in when we want to persuade people? Well, interestingly enough, we do a lot of it just automatically. I mean, without ever seeing this list, if you were going to have to persuade somebody of something, you would be doing a lot of that just from your gut feeling of how you might persuade other people. However, naturally, we don't want to leave it at that. We want you to have to apply some of these things. So here's what I'd like you to do. Knowing that you have to appeal to people's needs and values, which is another way also of saying what's in it for them, and knowing that these are the methods that will work, I'd like you to do a little practice persuasion, okay? How about getting together in groups of maybe 3? And here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick a public, anyone from that long list of publics the other day on D-Reg, and I want you then to see what kind of persuasive arguments, using these, you can come up with to appeal to what you assume or know the needs and values of that public to be. Let's talk about a few more points of persuasion before we move on to the next topic, because I think these may be useful to you. The methods of persuasion that I have given you here are really sort of the first step in the persuasion process. They are the ways that you start getting inside people's heads. You make them aware of the subject and you start their thought process. Once we get them to make the decision, then we got to keep them in the same decision and not let them get persuaded by somebody else. Well, as people